Greetings, everybody. I'm happy to be here tonight. And I'd like to welcome everyone who's going to be watching the recording of this live Q&A. I know that not everyone can always attend, and so this is why we record these sessions so that you can watch them at your convenience. So welcome. My name is Dr. Jessica Freedman, for those of you who don't know me, who may be joining us for the first time. And I am the chair and founder of MedEdit's Medical Admissions. I am a physician. I was a former faculty member, admissions committee member on the medical school faculty, as well as on the emergency medicine residency faculty at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. And I founded MedEdits more than 15 years ago. And we have been helping applicants get into medical school residency fellowship ever since our founding. So I have been involved in medical admissions for literally my entire career since I myself was a medical student. And so this is all we do. And I have established an amazing team of medical admissions experts, and we are, we really enjoy helping students as they follow their path to medicine. So in case those of you who don't know sort of our general routine for these Q&As, I do ask every day before I have them, I ask who has questions on our private Facebook group, and this allows people to post questions in advance. And then I always start off our Q&As by answering those questions, getting to as many of them as I possibly can. And then we launch into answering the questions that you post live. And so I ask, whoever has questions, because they might not be able to attend, to post those on our private Facebook group. If you are not a member of our private Facebook group, I encourage you to join our private Facebook group. We are really building a terrific community of like-minded pre-meds, and I am on the Facebook group every day answering questions and just making sure that everything is in order there. I would also like to congratulate all of our students, all of our applicants. We continue to have phenomenal results this season, and our students are getting some great acceptances, some wonderful interviews across the country, and our residency applicants are also starting to interview for their residency program. So we're really pleased with how everything is going. So let me go ahead, and I'm going to go to the Facebook group and just start answering those questions. We have some great questions today. So Ava asks, do you recommend an easier undergrad like University of Maryland to get a higher GPA versus an Ivy League undergraduate with a possibly lower GPA? Which one has a better chance of getting into med school? Do you have any statistics that what percentage of Maryland undergraduates go to medical schools? So we don't know the individual statistics for each undergraduate college. That would simply be impossible. We encourage parents, students to ask the undergraduate colleges specifically what their acceptance rates are for medical school. This is actually a pretty complicated question because there are several parts to it, and I'll try to get to everything. So first of all, when you are asking undergraduate colleges for their medical school acceptance data, there are a few things that you need to be aware of. First of all, not everyone who starts out pre-med as an undergraduate ends up pre-med. So there are many, many students who are going to start out as pre-med, and they're going to get weeded out when they start taking those introductory classes, maybe not doing as well as they wanted to do. And so that's why the statistics can be potentially misleading. The other thing is that not every undergraduate college, when they are giving you their data, they don't necessarily differentiate between which students are getting into MD granting or allopathic medical schools versus getting into DO or osteopathic medical schools. So you want to be sure to really push them for that data if it's not published online. Where you go to college truly does not matter in the medical school admissions process. Yes, there are going to be some elite colleges that have very high medical school acceptance rates. That isn't because of where those students are going to school. It's because those colleges tend to attract the most driven and the most talented students. So be careful when you're looking at matriculation lists for various undergraduate colleges. I can tell you that we work with undergraduates from a completely diverse group of colleges, from the top Ivy League schools to to state schools. And how well you do in the medical school admissions process has to do with what you achieve as an undergraduate, both academically, on a scholarly basis, on an extracurricular basis. And so you can be successful no matter where you go to undergraduate college. So just keep that in mind. Okay, next question. Shirley asks, what information should I look for to find the right fit of the medical schools? The missions and values of the schools are very similar and most just flowery language, which doesn't tell much. Shirley, you are absolutely right. Medical school missions, for the most part, are very, very similar. Now, the only way that they're not going to be similar is if, let's say, you're looking at a school that is really trying to recruit students who are interested in rural medicine, or if it, let's say, is a state school where they are trying to attract applicants who are really committed to practicing medicine in that state. Most medical schools will have very, very similar missions. So when you're trying to look at fit, first of all, we really encourage our students to look more closely at fit once they actually have acceptances. Now, why is that? It's very, very different than the college admissions process, which is usually the most familiar process for our applicants. And that is because most students are not getting multiple medical school acceptances. Most students, if they are lucky, they are getting a handful of medical school acceptances. So you really want to sort of try to figure out what that fit is going to be. What is the student body like? What is the preclinical, the first 2 years of medical school? What does that curriculum look like? It's going to be very, very similar across all medical schools. And what do the two clinical years look like? And again, that as well is going to be very, very similar across all medical schools. So you want to get an idea of, well, where are you doing your clinical rotations? Where are the hospitals based? Is there just one main hospital where students are doing rotations, or are those hospitals potentially scattered? Do students have to travel? What is the geography like, and does that appeal to your student? And so we really encourage students to think more about fit when they're going back for revisit days, or visit days in this case, since all interviews now are virtual for the most part. When you go back to accepted students days that usually happen in April, that's when you're really going to start to think more carefully about a school's mission and is it the right fit for the student. Okay. Ashwini asks, would a letter of recommendation from an atmospheric and oceanic sciences class, introduction to chemical oceanography, count as a science letter of recommendation? I would have to look to see, and you might actually need to check with the undergraduate college if that class is considered a science. I believe it would be considered a science, but there are so many classes now and so many different disciplines that things have, become much more nuanced in this way. My gut is that that would count as a science letter, but you really need to check with the undergraduate college if that's considered a science. Okay, Ruchi asks, thank you for doing these sessions. You are most welcome, Ruchi. If affordability is not an issue, is it better to go to a private out-of-state undergraduate school pre-med program like Vanderbilt, Duke, Tufts, Tulane, Case, with an attached medical school to gain a competitive edge not only at these schools, while you can still apply to your own in-state public med schools? Okay, so this is a slight variation on a question that we already got. So I encourage you to go back and listen to that question. But more specifically, if you're thinking about attending an undergraduate college because that college has an affiliated medical school and you think that that might offer an advantage, the primary reason why that might offer an advantage, say, like, just to use one of the examples that you provided, going to Vanderbilt, does that give you an advantage at Vanderbilt Medical School? The reason that it's going to potentially give you an advantage is because if you're going to undergrad at Vanderbilt, you are going to have easier access to opportunities, research, clinical, that might take place at the Vanderbilt hospital. So your letters of recommendation might be coming from those faculty. Maybe they would put in a good word for you with the admissions committee. So it isn't so much that medical schools give preference to their own undergraduates. It's more that the students who go to those undergraduate colleges are getting involved in the medical communities at those affiliated medical schools. And so that's what's offering the advantage for those students. But again, as I said earlier, you can go to medical school by going to any undergraduate college in this country. Okay. Praveen asks, which out-of-state pre-med programs have the highest acceptance rate to their med school? Similar question. And what to look for in a pre-med program for the best chance to acceptance to medical school. So again, you have to go to the undergraduate college, ask them what their medical school acceptance rate is. Keep in mind, many students don't make it to that application stage if they get weeded out. But certainly the most competitive colleges, the ones that have top-notch students, they are going to have very high acceptance rates to medical school. But you don't sort of be swayed by that necessarily. Your student actually might stand out more by going to a less competitive undergraduate college, getting top grades, taking full advantage of the opportunities at that undergraduate college, and then applying to medical school. So I don't feel that just applying from one of these elite colleges, that is not in and of itself what gives you an advantage when you're applying to med school. Okay, Mohan asks, do we still have hope for an interview? Mohan, you absolutely still have hope for an interview. We are only in the middle of November. I can tell you that interview invitations will be going out through March. Every year we have students who are interviewing after the new year. So, in January, February, March, even into April, potentially rare, but it happens, and they are getting accepted to medical school. At this point, interview invitations are going to be trickling in. They're not going to be pouring in, perhaps. But absolutely, you should not lose hope that there are still interview invitations coming. If we hit the new year, if we hit January and there still are no interview invitations, that's when we want to really dive deeply into a student's candidacy, into their application, and figure out, first of all, is there anything to salvage here to get interviews? And secondly, what should we be advising the student to do to improve their candidacy in case a reapplication becomes necessary? Okay, Praveed asks, do small liberal arts colleges with selective admissions rates like Colgate, Haverford, Pomona, are they better for pre-med for a higher GPA, higher acceptance rate into medical school, and highly selective public pre-med universities like Michigan, Wisconsin, Chapel Hill, Illinois, Urbana? I can tell you, I went to Haverford myself. The liberal arts colleges are really hard. It is not easy to get a high GPA at those schools. You're going to be working really, really hard in order to get that. It really, again, depends on the student and where that student is going to thrive. I don't think that a liberal arts college, again, in and of itself is going to offer an advantage in the medical school admissions process. But if your student enjoys small classes, enjoys more attention, and is going to thrive in a smaller setting like those that exist at Pomona, Colgate, Haverford, schools of that nature, then absolutely that should be their choice versus a public school where your classes are going to have hundreds of kids, especially the introductory classes. So it really depends on the students. At the smaller colleges, you also have the opportunity to get to know your professors much more easily. You're not dealing with TAs, you're dealing with the people who are teaching you directly. And so sometimes it's much easier to get strong letters of recommendation at those colleges. So these are all things you want to factor in when you're deciding where to attend. And of course, finances are a huge issue. For many students, going to an in-state school just makes great financial sense. Okay. Do medical schools for MD offer any merit-based scholarships, or are all of them need-based for applicants who are 21 or over? How does parents' income factor in? How do you look for merit-based scholarships? So there aren't merit-based scholarships that are listed in the same way as they are for undergraduate colleges that you apply for, that you know exist. I can tell you that our top students do get merit-based scholarships at some of the top medical schools in the country, at a variety of medical schools in the country. And then there are financial aid offers that the medical schools will make as well. If you end up getting acceptances to more than one medical school, sometimes you can try to kind of negotiate a little bit. Well, this med school gave me a little bit more money, and is there any way we can revisit the financial aid offer at this college, at this medical school, rather, to try to bump that offer, to try to match that offer. Okay, let's go ahead to our live questions. All right. How many interviews are typically required for admission to med school? This is a great question. And if you look at the data, most applicants who are getting accepted to medical school, who matriculate, have 3 or fewer interviews to med school. And I realize that's a shocking number. A lot of people, when they're applying to med school, they think they're going to get 10, 15 interviews. It is very rare to get interviews in the double digits. So 3 interviews is considered a really great number. So that's, if you're getting 3 interviews, you're in great shape. Okay, what is your success rate regarding your medical applicants that work with MedEdits? I encourage you to email us, info@mededits.com. We have a very, very high success rate for our students who work with us comprehensively from start to finish. We also actually have a very good success rate even for students who contact us just when they want to start working with us on their application. But when we're working with students from start to finish through the entire process, even before they're applying, so we can potentially influence what activities they're getting involved with, what letters of recommendation they're asking for, and of course, how they're presenting themselves in their documents, our students have tremendous success. It's really quite amazing, actually. Okay. Roughly how many months do you need for MCAT preparation? Wonderful question. We recommend a minimum of 3 months of preparation for the MCAT. And when we're talking about preparation for the MCAT and we're saying 3 months, that doesn't mean 3 months just working on the MCAT on the weekends. That means committing time to prepping for the MCAT, to reviewing your content, to practicing the strategy, 2 to 3 hours a day, 15 hours a week. Most students put in an average of 400 to 500 hours of prep time for the MCAT. So when you're deciding when to take the MCAT, it's really important to sort of march this out, to figure out when you're going to have that time to really commit to studying. Now, for some students, we might advise them to take longer. We might advise 6 months or 9 months. It really depends on the student. It depends on how they're doing on their practice tests. It depends on what their goals are and what score they really want to get on the MCAT, and where they ideally want to go to medical school. So there are going to be some variations in that recommendation, but 3 months is the absolute minimum. Okay. What non-US medical schools are good to consider if you aren't accepted to a US medical school? This is a tough question. We used to recommend Caribbean medical schools, but in recent years, we find that they accept many, many students, even those who predictably are not going to be able to pass USMLE, and those students potentially don't even, make it to their third and fourth year clerkships. And some of these med schools also have various start dates. Some of them offer students a lot of money, in terms of decreasing their financial burden. So attending a Caribbean medical school is definitely a challenge. If you are really committed to going to Caribbean medical school and you understand what those challenges are going to be, you certainly can be successful, but you need to understand what you're getting into. We also recommend Ochsner. Ochsner has great residency matches when you are considering an offshore medical school. The things to ask are how many students are starting first year of medical school, and what percentage of those students 4 years later are matching into categorical residencies. So when you're looking at residency programs, there are two major types of residencies. There are preliminary residency programs. Those are only 1-year residency programs. They're really just internships. They don't lead to board certification. Then there are categorical residencies, and those are 3 years and up, depending on the specialty. And those residency programs lead to board certification. So sometimes the Caribbean medical schools, other medical schools might boast amazing match rates, but they're not distinguishing between which of their students are matching into just 1-year programs and which are matching into categorical programs that are going to lead to board certification. So these are the kinds of questions that you want to be asking when you're considering going to an offshore medical school. And you also want to be looking at those match lists. Sometimes match lists can be very tough for someone who doesn't understand medical training to analyze, because sometimes you don't know what are good residency programs and what are not good residency programs. So this is something when we are advising our students in terms of which medical school to attend, we're looking very carefully at match lists. And that's one of the things that we're using to guide our students in terms of helping them to decide where to attend for medical school. All right, great questions tonight. Okay, how important is the MCAT score? It seems like it isn't very important anymore. Oh no, the MCAT is extremely important. It is the only way that medical school admissions committees can compare apples to apples. The average MCAT score for medical school matriculants has been 511.9 for the past 2 years in a row. That's for allopathic MD granting medical schools. And, because, grades, sometimes there are a lot of colleges that are going to have grade inflation. There are many students who are potentially taking the really hard classes somewhere else. And, they're taking the quote easier classes at their actual college. So, the MCAT is the only way to compare apples to apples. Med schools are not test optional, unlike colleges. So the MCAT is extremely important. We use that as a gauge for a student's competitiveness. It's one of the factors that we look at when we're advising students where they should be applying. Absolutely. Okay. Joshua asks, does medical offer a shorter curriculum if the student has medical experience? If the student was a nurse or a PA? No, unfortunately, medical schools do not offer an abbreviated curriculum, unfortunately, even if you have medical experience going into medical school. I can tell you, though, that if you have that really great clinical experience and you're applying to med school, that certainly is going to put you in a great position as far as your competitiveness for medical school. We are finding, that except for applicants to the most competitive, the most selective medical schools, we are finding at this point that clinical experience is valued more than research. That doesn't mean you shouldn't have research. We still recommend that any applicant who wants to be competitive for allopathic MD granting medical school, that they have research. But we're finding that students who aren't necessarily going for the tippy top medical schools, that it's really great when they have strong clinical experience. Now, for osteopathic medical schools, research is not as important either, but there again, we do want our students to have clinical exposure and clinical experience as much as possible. Okay. Okay, let me see here. What is a post baccalaureate? Is there any use of that to get into medical school admission? So, a post baccalaureate is generally a program, not generally, it is a program that is specifically designed for students who don't have their medical school prerequisites. So, students who potentially decided later as an undergraduate that they wanted to go to medical school. Some of the post bac programs will allow you to, let's say, have taken one of those prerequisites, and then you can take an elective, a higher level elective, when you are part of the post bac program. And also, a lot of those post bac programs have direct linkages to medical schools. So this can sometimes be a way to even potentially bypass the MCAT. There also is the possibility of designing your own post baccalaureate program, so not going through a formal program, which can be very expensive. And we have students, applicants who design their own post-bac programs, take all of their prerequisites at, potentially even more than one undergraduate institution or an extension school. So, the extension schools in California are very, very, popular with people. Okay. All right, let me see here. A student has competitive grades, high MCAT, and good extracurriculars, is interested in both MD and DO schools with a preference for MD school. The student has heard that it is preferable to apply first to MD schools to see if an interview is granted, and then DO schools if need to apply more broadly. This is due possibly to getting a DO acceptance early and not ready to commit. Okay, so we certainly have students who initially say, okay, I know I'm not the most competitive applicant to get into an MD school, but I want to try. And so they may the first year apply only to MD schools. And then if they have to reapply the second year, they then add on osteopathic medical schools during a reapplication. If a student is willing to go to an osteopathic medical school, if they don't get into MD school, we have them apply to both of those programs simultaneously. The top osteopathic medical schools are very, very competitive to get into. So we don't, let's say, want a student waiting until the absolute deadline for those schools to be submitting applications, because they're going to have a much lower chance of getting into osteopathic medical schools if they end up applying very late. So don't think that getting into osteopathic medical schools is easy. It's not easy. The top schools are really competitive, and they're looking for the top students who either are not interested in going to allopathic medical schools or the top students who didn't get into allopathic medical schools. So we would advise kind of adding those on late in the game. One of the drawbacks of osteopathic medical schools is that when you get an acceptance, the deposits are high, much higher than for allopathic schools. So sometimes students aren't thrilled with holding their place in an osteopathic medical school class when they're anticipating they're going to get into MD schools, but it just hasn't happened yet. So these are always kind of conversations that we have when we're trying to help a student decide if they should be applying to both MD and DO at the same time, or if they potentially should be doing that only if they have to reapply. Okay. Let me just see. Okay, so we applied to BSMD programs with Baylor, UAB, UA. We got accepted. What will the next step be? How about interviews with them compared to regular med school? So some BSMD programs are going to offer interviews before you are accepted. Other BSMD programs are going to offer interviews once you are part of the undergraduate class and before they officially accept is contingent on that interview performance. Honestly, the interview, if you do it later on, is no different than the traditional med school interview. The interview, if it is part of the admissions process when the student is still a high school student, is going to be really focused on trying to figure out if that student is really committed, if that student is really mature, and do they have the experience to be able to really make an informed decision when they're 17 or 18 years old that they want to go to medical school. So that's going to be the biggest difference if the student is interviewing as a high schooler versus interviewing as an undergraduate. Okay. My daughter had 5 interviews so far, but 3 are from very selective schools, but she has not heard from some of the lower tier schools. Should she be concerned about her odds of getting accepted by a school? Statistically speaking, if your daughter has 5 interviews, that is fantastic. And most applicants, I think I stated this earlier this evening, most applicants who are accepted to med school have 3 interviews, max of 3 interviews. So 5 interviews, she should be getting accepted to medical school this cycle. If they're very selective schools, you want to look at, are those acceptances offered on a rolling basis, or are those acceptances offered in bulk in March traditionally? Sometimes when a student is obviously very competitive, a lower tier medical school may not interview them because they don't want to waste their interview slots on somebody who potentially isn't going to attend. So if someone, for example, is applying to, a private med school that, isn't all that competitive, and they have, a 522 on the MCAT, and they have publications and research and clinical work, it's very possible they may not get interviews at schools, at private schools that are less competitive. The state schools, it's a whole different story because people have a lot of motivation, different motivations for wanting to attend their state schools. So that's a different kind of category. All right. I'm just looking at our questions here we have great questions tonight. Okay. When should a student start working with med edits for the best support in getting into medical school? It depends on what your goals are. We love it when students start working with us early in the process, so we really can kind of understand how they're developing, what their interests are. We can potentially impact what they're doing, how they're choosing to spend their time, how they're choosing to spend their summers, coming up with a timeline for them. So earlier is always better, but I can also tell you that as long as you start working with us by, let's say, February or March of the application year, we can have tremendous impact in terms of your overall success based on how you're presenting yourself to admissions committees, because that application is what is going to determine whether you get interviews or not. And so that's, your written documents in this process become extremely, extremely important, together with your letters of recommendation, your transcripts, and the other written parts of your application, secondary essays as well. Okay. All right. Why do some schools send out acceptances now and others make you wait and wait? I don't have a great answer for that. Different schools do this differently. Some schools change from year to year in terms of how they extend acceptances. The most competitive schools, as I've said before, will, like to extend all of their acceptances at once. Admissions committees meet at different times. Maybe your interviewer didn't attend that admissions committee meeting. So there's so many different variables that are going to determine when you're reviewed potentially during the application process and when that decision is going to go out. My son has an MCAT score of 519 and still only got 1 interview. Do we still have hope for more interviews? A 519 is a really high score, assuming that the other parts of the application are as competitive. I would expect him to have more than one interview. You absolutely still have hope in terms of receiving more interviews. We also want to know when he submitted his application. Was it an early application? Was it a late application? Was there anything else that potentially delayed that application, like letters of recommendation or transcripts or secondary essays? So someone who has a 519, assuming that the other parts of the application of the candidacy are at the same level, we absolutely expect that student to get more interviews. And if they're not, then we're looking at why isn't this student getting more interviews? And we really need to look at the verified application and look at all the different ingredients to figure that out. Okay. Gap year does not help in GPA, right? Do any additional studies help in improving GPA? Absolutely. A gap year, if you're working, obviously doesn't help your GPA, but there are programs called special master's programs that are specifically designed for applicants who will be applying to medical school, students who will be applying to medical school, and they're specifically designed for students who need academic enhancement. And the AAMC, the Association of American Medical Colleges, has a great database where you can search all of these programs up and you select academic enhancement programs, and you'll find all these programs. If your student does not want to join a formal program, they of course are welcome to take undergraduate classes on their own to boost their GPA, and that is absolutely added to the application and factored into the overall GPA. We always have students who maybe they weren't very focused, maybe they were distracted, maybe they didn't have the maturity to do well early in college, who definitely need that academic enhancement to become more competitive applicants. This is not uncommon. Okay. All right. Let me see. Okay, Jennifer asks, can you shed some light on what happens after the interview? Does the interviewer write an evaluation on the student's interview, or do they meet in person to discuss? So Jennifer, this is going to depend on the med school, and every medical school does this differently. There are some medical schools where they have so many different interviewers, and especially now that things are all virtual, and they have people who are interviewing applicants, people from the community, so community physicians who maybe are affiliated with the medical school. There are going to be administrators who are evaluating students and doing interviews. There are going to be PhDs who are interviewing applicants. So there are definitely going to be some medical schools where there is a written report, and then there's a smaller committee that's going to be making those decisions. But then there are other medical schools where, let's say, they have a smaller group of interviewers and they're all meeting either virtually or in person to make those decisions. So that's going to be really medical school dependent. Obviously, when you have an MMI interview, it's unlikely that everyone's coming together. Sometimes there's going to be evaluation immediately after an interview, but more frequently there are going to be committee meetings, on a weekly basis, maybe a bi-weekly basis. Usually students are given that information. Sometimes after an interview, they'll let the student know potentially when the committee's meeting or when the student should expect to hear about a decision. Okay, I'm going to answer one more question. These are terrific questions tonight. Okay, let's go over this one. Can you talk about MD versus DO programs and getting into a specialty residency? Are DO paths generally primary care physicians? So yeah, if you were to look at the data, the majority of osteopathic physicians are practicing primary care. And that is partly based on the mission of those schools. It's partly based on the interest that those students have, the exposure those students have. But A lot of it is also just based on the fact that it is going to be more difficult as an osteopathic medical school graduates to get into the most competitive residencies and the most competitive specialties. So if your student is someone who definitely, let's say, wants to be an ophthalmologist or a plastic surgeon or a dermatologist, the goal should be to get into an MD granting school. Now, are there osteopathic physicians who practice in all of the most competitive specialties in medicine? Absolutely. But it's really important if you go to osteopathic medical school and you want to, let's say, become a neurosurgeon, that you are, at the top of your class and that you're doing everything possible to really make sure that you are going to stand out in the residency match process and the residency application process. And the way to stand out in the residency application process is very different than what you need to do to stand out in the medical school admissions process. So it's a very different strategy and approach. Okay. All right, I'm going to answer one more question tonight. Delavat asks, are any minimum hours for clinical experience for selection of the colleges? So do medical schools have a minimum number of hours of clinical experience they want students to have? Medical schools are not going to tell you how many hours they want you to have. If you want to see how many students, let's say, have clinical experience for a given medical school, you can go to the MSAR, the medical school admissions requirements, and it's an online database. Every allopathic medical school is listed. And there you can find for every allopathic med school in the US, what percentage of their matriculants have, let's say, clinical experience, what percentage have research experience. However, you're not going to be able to see how many hours the students have. So, again, when we are making these recommendations of what type of experience a student should have and how much experience, we're looking at it the same way the med school admissions committees are looking at this. We're looking at it holistically. We're considering where all the students' experiences are. Not every student necessarily needs thousands of hours of scribing or working as a medical assistant, because they may have something else in their background that really sets them apart. So we try to veer away from making sort of absolute hours recommendations for students, because it really depends on the full picture for that individual student. So thank you all for attending. I actually think maybe this is a great time to do lives. And but next week, because it's Thanksgiving, and I hope you are all preparing for Thanksgiving, I will be doing a live on Tuesday, I believe at 11 a.m. So we're gonna be doing that at a different time next week. So stay tuned for that. I hope you can all attend, and then we will probably be back on the regular track, unless Tuesday at 11 ends up being a great time for everybody. And if anyone has suggestions on when these might be a better time, I'm open to suggestions. So please let us know. Again, if you're not part of our parents Facebook group, please join the Facebook group. And I'm going to go ahead and just put that in the chat for everybody, because you can get all of the information that we have about when we're going live and everything else there. Okay, I'm just going to put this in the chat for you. And I thank you all. It's right there. You should see it in a moment. Okay, and I thank you all for showing up tonight. It was great to see everyone. I think there was a great mix of questions, and I wish you all a terrific weekend. Stay safe, and I will see you all next week. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.